They called her too emotional for combat operations, too sensitive for special forces, too caring to make the hard decisions that military leadership demanded. But when the Pentagon's most classified mission hung in the balance, when every conventional approach had failed and American hostages faced certain death, Captain Sofia Reyes would prove that sometimes the military's greatest weakness becomes its most powerful weapon. Before we jump back in, tell us where you're tuning in from, and if this story touches you, make sure you're subscribed, because tomorrow I've saved something extra special for you. Sofia Maria Reyes was 7 years old when she first understood that feelings could be weapons. She was sitting in the kitchen of their small apartment in San Antonio, Texas, watching her father, Colonel Miguel Reyes, carefully clean his service pistol at the dining table. The metal gleamed under the fluorescent light, each component laid out with military precision. "Mija," her father said without looking up from his work, "what do you think makes a soldier dangerous?" Sofia considered the question seriously, as she did everything her father asked her. At 7, she already possessed an unusual intensity that made adults uncomfortable during parent-teacher conferences. Her teachers called her emotionally mature beyond her years and deeply empathetic, phrases that sounded like compliments but carried an undertone of concern. "The gun?" she offered tentatively. Colonel Reyes smiled and shook his head. "Any fool can fire a weapon, Sofia. What makes a soldier truly dangerous is understanding people, knowing what they fear, what they want, what makes them fight or surrender. That's the real weapon." He gestured for her to come closer. Sofia climbed onto the chair beside him, careful not to disturb the arranged gun parts. Her father had returned from his 3rd deployment in Afghanistan just 2 months earlier, and she was still adjusting to having him home. During his absence, she had learned to read her mother's moods like weather patterns, the tight smile that meant money was running low, the distant stare that meant she was worried about Daddy, the forced cheerfulness that meant she was trying to protect Sofia from adult fears. "You see things other people miss, Mija," Colonel Reyes continued, his weathered hands working methodically. "Yesterday, when Mrs. Garcia from next door brought us tamales, you knew she was sad before she even spoke. You asked about her son without anyone telling you he was having trouble in school. That's not normal for a 7-year-old. Sofia frowned. "Being not normal usually meant being in trouble. Is that bad?" "No," her father said firmly. "It's a gift. But gifts can become burdens if you don't learn to use them right. In the Army, I've seen soldiers who could shoot expert marksman scores, but couldn't read the fear in a child's eyes during a village patrol. I've seen officers who could plan perfect tactical operations, but missed the doubt in their own men's voices. They had the tools, but they were missing the most important weapon of all." "What weapon?" "The ability to understand what people are really thinking and feeling. To know when someone is lying, when they're about to break, when they need encouragement, or when they're dangerous. Your mother calls it emotional intelligence, but I call it battlefield awareness that works on people instead of terrain." Sofia absorbed this information the way she absorbed everything completely, and with an intensity that made her dark eyes seem older than her years. She had always been aware of the emotions swirling around her like invisible currents. In school, she could sense when her teacher, Ms. Rodriguez, was having problems at home because her voice became artificially bright and her hands shook slightly when she wrote on the blackboard. She knew which classmates were genuinely confident and which ones were covering up insecurity with loudness or aggression. Most adults found this awareness unsettling. During her last parent-teacher conference, Ms. Rodriguez had pulled her parents aside with concerns. "Sofia is academically gifted, but she's intense. She asks very personal questions. Yesterday, she asked if I was sad about my divorce before. I had mentioned being divorced to anyone at school. It's like she can see through people, and honestly, it makes some of the other children uncomfortable." Sofia's mother, Maria Reyes, had apologized and promised to talk to Sofia about boundaries. But Colonel Reyes had a different perspective. That night, he had found Sofia reading in her room, not children's books, but his discarded copies of Military Psychology Review and Leadership in Combat Situations. She was 8 years old and reading at a college level, but more importantly, she was trying to understand the science behind what came naturally to her. "Sofia," he had said, sitting on the edge of her bed, "your teacher thinks you ask too many questions about feelings." "I make people nervous," Sofia replied matter-of-factly. "I can tell when they don't want me to know things about them. But I can't help seeing it. What do you see when you look at me right now?" Sofia studied her father's face with the same intensity she brought to everything. "You're proud of me, but you're also worried. You think my gift might cause problems for me when I get older. You're remembering something from your deployment, something about a soldier who couldn't read people, and it went bad." Colonel Reyes was quiet for a long moment. His daughter had, with startling accuracy, identified his exact emotional state, and even guessed at the specific memory that was troubling him. There had indeed been a young lieutenant in his unit who had missed every social cue during village interactions, who had treated every Iraqi civilian as a potential threat because he couldn't distinguish between fear, anger, and genuine hostility. That lieutenant's inability to read people had led to several dangerous incidents and ultimately contributed to his early removal from active duty. "What if," he said carefully, "instead of making people nervous, you learn to use this gift to help people? What if you became so good at understanding others that you could protect them, lead them, even save them?" Sofia's eyes lit up with a spark that would define the next 20 years of her life. Like a soldier? Like the best kind of soldier. From that night forward, Sofia's unusual gift became the center of her identity and ambition. Colonel Reyes began bringing home books on military psychology, negotiation tactics, and behavioral analysis. He taught her to recognize the physical signs of deception microexpressions that lasted fractions of seconds, changes in posture that indicated stress, vocal patterns that revealed hidden emotions. By age 10, Sofia could walk into a room and immediately assess the social dynamics, identifying who held real power versus who appeared to be in charge, who was allied with whom, and where the potential conflicts lay. She practiced these skills everywhere: at school, at the grocery store, during family gatherings. What had once been an instinctive but chaotic ability became a refined and deliberate tool. Her academic performance was exceptional, but her real education happened during her father's evening lessons. Colonel Reyes would show her footage from military training exercises, pausing to ask her to analyze the body language of soldiers under stress. He taught her about combat psychology, about how fear and adrenaline affected decision-making, about the subtle signs that indicated when someone was about to break under pressure versus when they were finding hidden reserves of courage. "The enemy isn't always holding a weapon, Mija," he would say. "Sometimes the enemy is panic spreading through your own troops. Sometimes it's miscommunication between allies. Sometimes it's a civilian who seems cooperative but is actually gathering intelligence. A soldier who can read these situations can prevent disasters before they happen." Sofia's mother watched this intensive education with mixed feelings. She was proud of her husband's dedication to their daughter's development, but worried about the intensity of Sofia's focus on military psychology. "She's still a child, Miguel," Maria would say during their late-night conversations. "She should be playing with dolls and worrying about homework, not analyzing combat footage." But Sofia had no interest in typical childhood activities. She devoured every book on military strategy, leadership psychology, and behavioral analysis that her father brought home. She memorized the biographies of famous military leaders, not for their tactical brilliance, but for their ability to inspire, motivate, and understand their troops. She was particularly fascinated by leaders like General Dwight Eisenhower, who had succeeded not through aggressive tactics, but through his ability to manage complex personalities and forge unlikely alliances. By high school, Sofia's reputation as someone who could read people was well established. Classmates came to her for advice about relationships. Teachers consulted her about handling difficult students, and even her parents' friends began asking for her insights about workplace conflicts. She had learned to moderate her intensity, to ask questions in ways that didn't make people defensive, and to offer observations as helpful insights rather than unsettling revelations. But her ultimate goal never wavered. Sofia Reyes was going to join the military, and she was going to use her unique abilities to serve her country in ways that no one had imagined before. She studied military academies, researched career paths in military intelligence and special operations, and maintained perfect grades while excelling in physical fitness. She learned multiple languages, studied international relations, and even took psychology courses at the local community college during her senior year. Her guidance counselor, Mrs. Patterson, was supportive but realistic during their college planning sessions. "Sofia, you're certainly qualified for military service, and your psychological insights would be valuable in intelligence work. But you should understand that the military can be challenging for people who are as emotionally perceptive as you are. The culture tends to value stoicism and emotional control above sensitivity and empathy." Sofia nodded politely, but privately disagreed. She had spent years studying military history and psychology. She understood that the most successful military operations weren't won by the most aggressive or emotionally detached soldiers, but by those who could understand their enemies, inspire their allies, and make complex human calculations under pressure. She was convinced that her emotional intelligence wasn't a liability. It was exactly what the military needed, even if they didn't know it yet. On graduation day, as Sofia stood in her cap and gown, surrounded by classmates heading to traditional colleges, she felt the weight of her father's expectations and her own ambitions. Colonel Reyes had been promoted to his current rank partly because of his ability to understand and motivate soldiers under extreme stress. Sofia intended to take those same skills and push them to levels the military had never seen before. "You ready for this, Mija?" her father asked as they walked to the car after the ceremony. Sofia looked back at the high school where she had spent 4 years quietly studying her classmates like test subjects, where she had learned to calibrate her gift without losing its power. Tomorrow she would begin the next phase of her preparation for military service. She would face instructors and fellow cadets who might not understand her approach, who might see her emotional perceptiveness as weakness rather than strength. "I've been ready my whole life," she replied. Colonel Reyes smiled with pride and concern in equal measure. He had taught his daughter to weaponize empathy, to turn emotional intelligence into a tactical advantage. Now she would have to prove that the military's most unconventional weapon could also be its most powerful one. Sofia's preparation for military service began the summer after high school graduation with an intensity that concerned even her father. While her classmates spent their final summer of freedom at parties and beach trips, Sofia implemented a regimen that would have challenged seasoned soldiers. She woke at 5:00 hours every morning, completed a 6-mile run through the hills surrounding San Antonio, then spent 2 hours in physical training that combined traditional military exercises with specialized drills designed to test decision-making under physical stress. But the real preparation happened in her mind. Sofia had convinced the local Army recruiting station to let her observe their psychological evaluation process, supposedly for a high school research project that had actually ended months earlier. Staff Sergeant Jennifer Walsh, the recruitment officer, had been impressed by Sofia's academic credentials and military family background, agreeing to let her shadow the evaluation sessions in exchange for helping with administrative work. What Sofia discovered during those observations fundamentally changed her understanding of how the military assessed psychological fitness. She watched dozens of potential recruits undergo standardized psychological evaluations designed to identify mental health issues, stress tolerance, and leadership potential. The tests were thorough but rigid, measuring responses to hypothetical scenarios using predetermined criteria that valued emotional control and suppressed empathy above all else. The ideal soldier profile hasn't changed much in 50 years, Staff Sergeant Walsh explained during one of their conversations. We want people who can follow orders without hesitation, who won't be paralyzed by emotional responses in combat, and who can make hard decisions without being influenced by personal feelings about the consequences. Sofia nodded politely while mentally cataloging everything that was wrong with this approach. The evaluation process was designed to identify and eliminate exactly the qualities that she believed were most valuable in modern military operations. Soldiers who could read cultural nuances during peacekeeping missions, who could distinguish between genuine threats and frightened civilians, who could inspire loyalty in local populations. These capabilities were being systematically screened out in favor of emotional detachment. During her lunch breaks, Sofia would drive to the San Antonio Public Library and research military psychology studies that contradicted the recruitment criteria she was observing. She found extensive documentation of military failures caused not by soldiers who were too emotional, but by leaders who couldn't understand the human elements of complex situations. The Bay of Pigs invasion had failed partly because intelligence officers couldn't accurately assess Cuban popular sentiment. Vietnam-era counterinsurgency efforts had been hampered by American forces' inability to distinguish between hostile combatants and sympathetic civilians. More recently, early mistakes in Iraq and Afghanistan had been attributed to cultural insensitivity and poor human intelligence gathering. Sofia began developing her own training program based on these insights. She studied foreign languages not just for vocabulary and grammar, but to understand how different cultures expressed emotion and respect. She practiced meditation and mindfulness techniques, not to suppress her emotional awareness, but to maintain clarity and decision-making capability while processing intense emotional information from multiple sources. Simultaneously, her physical training became more sophisticated as well. Colonel Reyes arranged for Sofia to train with active-duty soldiers at nearby Fort Sam Houston, where she could experience realistic combat scenarios while maintaining her focus on human psychology. During urban warfare simulations, while other participants focused on tactical movement and weapons handling, Sofia analyzed the stress responses of her teammates, identifying who was likely to panic under pressure, who needed encouragement, and who might make reckless decisions when adrenaline peaked. "Reyes, what the hell are you doing?" Sergeant First Class Robert Kim had asked during one particularly intense training exercise. Sofia had been positioned behind cover during a simulated firefight, but instead of focusing entirely on her assigned sector, she had been monitoring the radio chatter and body language of her squad mates. "Sergeant Martinez is about to break," Sofia had replied calmly, indicating a soldier whose voice was becoming increasingly strained over the radio. His breathing pattern changed 3 minutes ago, and he started repeating orders instead of acknowledging them. "If we don't rotate him out or provide support, he's going to make a mistake that compromises the mission." Sergeant Kim had been skeptical until Martinez did exactly what Sofia predicted, abandoned his position without authorization, leaving a gap in their defensive line that the opposing force immediately exploited. The exercise ended with their team's defeat, but Sofia's prediction had been noted by the observing instructors. These training experiences confirmed Sofia's belief that traditional military psychology was missing crucial capabilities, but they also revealed the challenges she would face in convincing others. When she shared her insights about team dynamics and stress responses, some instructors were impressed, but others were uncomfortable with her level of emotional analysis. Several comments in her training evaluations mentioned her unusual focus on psychological factors and her tendency to overthink interpersonal dynamics during combat scenarios. Sofia's academic preparation was equally intensive. She enrolled in summer courses at the University of Texas San Antonio, focusing on psychology, international relations, and military history. Her professors were initially surprised by her depth of knowledge and sophisticated understanding of military psychology concepts, but they quickly recognized her exceptional analytical capabilities. Dr. James Carter, her military psychology professor, became an unofficial mentor during this period. Dr. Carter was a former Army psychologist who had served in Iraq and Afghanistan, and he was one of the few people who fully understood the value of Sofia's approach. Most military psychologists work after the fact, he explained during one of their office hour discussions. We treat PTSD, evaluate fitness for duty, analyze leadership failures after they've already caused problems. What you're describing is preventive military psychology, identifying and addressing psychological factors before they become operational problems. Under Dr. Carter's guidance, Sofia began developing theoretical frameworks for integrating emotional intelligence into military operations. She wrote research papers on topics like predictive behavioral analysis in small unit leadership and cultural empathy as a force multiplier in counterinsurgency operations. Her work was sophisticated enough that Dr. Carter encouraged her to present her findings at undergraduate research conferences, where her ideas attracted attention from military psychology researchers. But Sofia's most important preparation happened through direct experience with military culture. She spent weekends attending veteran support group meetings, not as a participant, but as a volunteer coordinator. This work gave her exposure to soldiers dealing with combat trauma, career transitions, and the psychological challenges of military service. She learned to recognize the signs of PTSD, depression, and adjustment disorders. But more importantly, she learned how to communicate with military personnel who were skeptical of psychological intervention. The hardest part isn't diagnosing the problem, explained Master Sergeant Linda Thompson, a veteran who ran one of the support groups Sofia volunteered with. It's getting soldiers to trust you enough to accept help. Military culture teaches people to suppress emotional vulnerability, so when they finally need psychological support, they've been conditioned to see it as weakness. Sofia absorbed this lesson completely. She realized that her emotional intelligence would only be valuable if she could apply it in ways that aligned with military values rather than challenging them. She began framing her insights in terms of operational effectiveness, tactical advantage, and mission success rather than emotional well-being or psychological health. By the end of that transformative summer, Sofia had developed capabilities that extended far beyond traditional military training. She could assess the psychological state of individuals and groups with remarkable accuracy, predict behavioral responses under stress, and identify interpersonal dynamics that might affect mission performance. She had also learned to communicate these insights in language that military personnel would accept and value. Her father watched this development with growing amazement and concern. "Mija, you're developing skills that most military psychologists don't acquire until after years of field experience. But you're also setting yourself up for disappointment if the military isn't ready for your approach." Sofia understood his concern, but she remained convinced that her preparation would prove valuable. She had spent months studying the gap between what the military said it wanted in soldiers and what actually contributed to operational success. She was confident that her unique combination of emotional intelligence and tactical understanding would eventually be recognized as an asset rather than a liability. "I'm not trying to change the military overnight, Dad," she replied. "I just want to be ready when they need what I can do." As summer ended and Sofia prepared to enter the military evaluation process, she carried with her not just exceptional physical fitness and academic credentials, but a sophisticated understanding of human psychology applied to military operations. She had weaponized empathy in ways that most people couldn't imagine, and she was about to discover whether the military was ready for a soldier who could read hearts and minds as accurately as tactical maps. The Military Occupational Specialty Evaluation Center at Fort Hood, Texas, processed hundreds of potential recruits every month, but Sofia Reyes arrived with credentials that immediately set her apart from typical candidates. Her academic transcripts showed a 4.0 GPA with advanced coursework in psychology and international relations. Her physical fitness scores exceeded requirements for special operations consideration. Her father's distinguished service record and her own research, publications in military psychology had earned her direct consideration for intelligence and special operations roles. Major Jennifer Walsh, the evaluation officer, reviewed Sofia's file with obvious interest during their initial interview. The sterile conference room felt more like a corporate job interview than a military assessment, with its bland gray walls and fluorescent lighting creating an atmosphere of bureaucratic efficiency rather than military tradition. Miss Reyes, your qualifications are exceptional for someone your age. Major Walsh began, flipping through pages of test scores and recommendations. Your psychological assessment scores are in the 99th percentile for analytical thinking and stress tolerance. Your language aptitude tests suggest you could master new languages rapidly. Your research work on military psychology is graduate level. Quality. Sofia sat with perfect posture, hands folded, maintaining the respectful attention her father had taught her to display during official interactions. Thank you, ma'am. I'm committed to serving in whatever capacity best utilizes my abilities. That's what we need to discuss, Major Walsh continued, her tone shifting slightly. Your psychological evaluation also revealed some unusual patterns that require additional assessment. The word unusual sent a chill through Sofia's chest, but she maintained her composed expression. She had anticipated that her emotional intelligence might be viewed as abnormal by standardized military psychological tests, but she had hoped her other qualifications would outweigh any concerns. Major Walsh opened a thick folder containing Sofia's psychological evaluation results. Your empathy scores are off the charts, literally beyond the range our assessment tools are designed to measure. Your emotional awareness indicators suggest you process interpersonal information at levels that exceed our established parameters. For military personnel, ma'am, I believe those capabilities could be valuable assets in modern military operations, Sofia replied carefully. My research has shown that emotional intelligence contributes significantly to leadership effectiveness, cultural navigation, and tactical decision-making. I understand your perspective, Miss Reyes, but we need to discuss the practical implications of your psychological profile. Major Walsh pulled out a specific document that Sofia recognized as the Standardized Military Personality Assessment. During your scenario-based evaluations, you consistently prioritized understanding the motivations and emotional states of hypothetical enemies, allies, and civilians over implementing direct tactical solutions. Sofia remembered those scenarios clearly. She had been presented with situations like responding to hostile crowds during peacekeeping operations, interrogating captured combatants, and managing conflicts between allied forces. In each case, she had focused first on analyzing the psychological dynamics involved, seeking to understand underlying causes of conflicts before recommending tactical responses. For example, Major Walsh continued, in the hostage rescue scenario, while other candidates immediately began planning tactical approaches to neutralize threats, you spent significant time analyzing the psychological profile of the hostage takers, theorizing about their motivations, and developing strategies for psychological manipulation and negotiation. Those strategies had higher success probabilities than direct assault options, Sofia responded, trying to keep defensiveness out of her voice. Understanding enemy psychology is fundamental to developing effective tactical responses. Perhaps But your approach raises concerns about your ability to make rapid decisions under pressure when emotional considerations might compromise operational effectiveness. Major Walsh's tone remained professional, but Sofia could detect the underlying skepticism. Military operations often require decisive action based on limited information, without time for extensive psychological analysis. The conversation continued for another hour, with Major Walsh presenting scenario after scenario where Sofia's responses had prioritized emotional intelligence over conventional military thinking. Sofia defended her approaches methodically, citing research and historical examples, but she could feel the evaluation moving in an unwelcome direction. The final blow came when Major Walsh introduced Dr. Richard Stone, a military psychologist who had been observing the interview from an adjacent room. Dr. Stone was a thin, precise man in his 50s whose demeanor suggested years of reducing complex human behaviors to standardized categories. "Miss Reyes," Dr. Stone began, consulting his notes, "your psychological profile indicates what we classify as hyper-empathic tendencies, combined with emotional overprocessing. While these traits might be valuable in civilian psychology or social work careers, they present significant risks in military contexts." Sofia felt her carefully maintained composure beginning to crack. Dr. Stone, with respect, "I believe that classification misunderstands the tactical applications of emotional intelligence in modern military operations." "Let me be more specific," Dr. Stone continued, apparently unmoved by her objection. "During combat stress simulations, you consistently showed elevated concern for enemy casualties, hesitation to authorize actions that might cause civilian emotional trauma, and tendency to second-guess orders based on psychological rather than tactical considerations. I showed concern for minimizing unnecessary casualties and maximizing operational effectiveness through psychological understanding," Sofia corrected, her voice carrying a slight edge despite her efforts to remain professional. "Exactly, Dr. Stone replied. "In combat situations, soldiers need to follow orders quickly and decisively without being paralyzed by emotional considerations about consequences. Your profile suggests you would be unreliable in situations requiring harsh but necessary actions." Major Walsh nodded in agreement. "Miss Reyes, your emotional sensitivity, while admirable in civilian contexts, is fundamentally incompatible with military requirements. Combat operations require personnel who can suppress emotional responses, make difficult decisions without hesitation, and prioritize mission objectives over personal feelings about consequences." The room fell silent except for the hum of fluorescent lights. Sofia stared at the evaluation documents spread across the table, seeing her dreams of military service dissolving into bureaucratic classifications and psychological categories. Everything she had worked for, all the preparation and research and training, was being dismissed because she cared too much about understanding people. "Ma'am," Sofia said quietly, "I respectfully disagree with this assessment. I believe my emotional intelligence enhances rather than compromises my tactical capabilities." "Miss Reyes," Major Walsh replied, with what might have been genuine sympathy, "I understand your disappointment, but military psychology standards exist for important reasons. We've seen too many cases where soldiers who couldn't suppress emotional responses became liabilities to their units and missions." Dr. Stone added his final assessment. "Your psychological profile indicates you would be particularly vulnerable to conditions like moral injury, compassion fatigue, and decision paralysis under combat stress. These conditions not only compromise individual performance but can endanger entire units." Sofia felt the familiar sensation of adults making decisions about her life based on their fear of her capabilities rather than their understanding of her potential. But this time, the stakes were higher than a concerned teacher or worried guidance counselor. This was her entire future being classified as incompatible with her deepest convictions. However, Major Walsh continued, we don't want to waste your considerable talents entirely. We can offer you a position as a communications specialist with intelligence support duties. It's important work that would utilize your language skills and analytical capabilities while keeping you in roles more suited to your psychological profile. Communications specialist. Sofia understood immediately what this meant: a desk job. Processing radio transmissions and translating documents, far from the field operations where her unique skills might actually matter. It was the military equivalent of being too short to be a pilot, but acceptable as a mechanic. I appreciate the offer, ma'am, Sofia replied, her voice steady despite the crushing disappointment. I accept the communications specialist position. Major. Walsh smiled with the relief of someone who had successfully managed a difficult conversation. Excellent. You'll report to Fort Sterling in Colorado for advanced communications training. Your language skills and analytical background will be valuable assets in that role. As Sofia signed the assignment papers, she felt the same controlled determination that had sustained her through years of preparation. They saw her emotional intelligence as a weakness, as something that would make her unreliable under pressure. But Sofia knew they were wrong. She would prove that understanding people wasn't a liability. It was the most powerful weapon the military had never learned to use. Walking out of Fort Hood that afternoon, Sofia carried not just her assignment papers, but a burning conviction that this rejection was temporary. Communications specialist was not her destination. It was her starting point. She would show them that the soldier who understood hearts and minds could accomplish things that conventional warriors never imagined. Fort Sterling, Colorado, sat nestled in the shadow of the Rocky Mountains like a concrete and steel afterthought in one of nature's most spectacular settings. The base specialized in intelligence gathering and communications operations, serving as a critical hub for coordinating military activities across the western United States and international operations, requiring sophisticated signal processing capabilities. Sofia arrived on a crisp October morning, her single duffel bag containing everything she owned and her head filled with determination to make the most of what everyone else considered a consolation prize. The communications building was a 3-story structure filled with banks of computers, radio equipment, and the constant hum of electronic devices processing thousands of messages every hour. Technical Sergeant Amanda Rivers, Sofia's immediate supervisor, was a career communications specialist with 15 years of experience and the weary efficiency of someone who had learned to manage expectations rather than pursue ambitions. She gave Sofia the standard orientation tour with the enthusiasm of someone reading from a script she had memorized years earlier. Your primary responsibilities will be monitoring radio transmissions from field operations, translating intercepted communications in foreign languages, and maintaining communication logs for intelligence analysis, Sergeant Rivers explained. As they walked past rows of workstations where uniformed personnel sat wearing headphones and staring at computer screens. It's important work, but it's also routine work. Most of what you'll process is logistical coordination and status reports. Sofia nodded politely while mentally cataloging everything that was wrong with how this operation was being conducted. The communications specialists were treating their work like data entry, mechanically processing messages without analyzing the psychological content that could provide crucial intelligence insights. They were listening to words without hearing the voices, recording information without understanding the people behind it. Her workstation was located in a corner of the main communications floor, equipped with standard radio monitoring equipment, translation software, and access to military communication networks. Sofia was assigned to monitor communications from peacekeeping operations in Eastern Europe, where American forces were working with NATO allies to maintain stability in regions still recovering from ethnic conflicts. The work was exactly as routine as Sergeant Rivers had described. Sofia spent her days listening to field commanders requesting supply drops, coordinating patrol schedules, and reporting equipment maintenance issues. The communications were professionally conducted and strategically unimportant, the kind of mundane military business that kept operations functioning but rarely contained actionable intelligence. But Sofia listened differently than her colleagues. While other communications specialists focused on accurately transcribing message content, Sofia analyzed vocal patterns, stress indicators, and subtle changes in communication protocols that might reveal information not contained in the actual words being transmitted. Within her first week, she began noticing patterns that troubled her. Captain Derek Morrison, commanding a peacekeeping unit near the Serbian border, had been gradually changing his communication style over the past month. His reports remained factually accurate and professionally worded, but his voice carried increasing tension, and he had begun requesting confirmation for routine decisions that previously wouldn't have required higher authorization. Sofia documented these observations in her personal notes, but quickly discovered that her concerns had no official channel for reporting. Communications specialists were expected to process and record transmissions, not analyze the psychological state of field commanders. Her supervisor, Sergeant Rivers, was polite but dismissive when Sofia mentioned her observations during their weekly review meeting. "Private Reyes, I appreciate your attention to detail, but psychological analysis of field personnel isn't part of our job description," Sergeant Rivers explained. If Captain Morrison was experiencing significant problems, his direct superior would identify and address them through proper command channels. Sofia understood the logic of this response, but she also recognized the flaw in it. Command structures were designed to detect and respond to obvious problems, equipment failures, tactical difficulties, personnel conflicts that disrupted operations. They were not equipped to identify subtle psychological changes that might indicate developing problems before they became operational crises. Her frustration grew as she continued monitoring communications and identifying patterns that no one else seemed interested in analyzing. Lieutenant Sarah Chun, leading a cultural liaison team in Bosnia, was showing signs of increasing isolation from her unit, evidenced by shortened radio transmissions and reluctance to engage in the informal communication that typically characterized small unit operations. Staff Sergeant Michael Torres, coordinating supply operations in Croatia, was exhibiting stress indicators that suggested he was dealing with problems he couldn't or wouldn't report through official channels. Sofia began developing detailed psychological profiles of the personnel whose communication she monitored, tracking changes in their stress levels, decision-making patterns, and interpersonal dynamics with their units. She created unofficial files documenting her observations, complete with predictions about potential problems and recommendations for interventions that could prevent developing issues from becoming operational crises. The irony was not lost on her. She was using exactly the skills that had been deemed incompatible with military service to identify problems that conventional military psychology was missing entirely. Her emotional intelligence was revealing insights that could save lives and prevent mission failures, but she had no way to act on her knowledge. Her colleagues viewed her intensity with a mixture of curiosity and mild concern. During lunch breaks in the base cafeteria, other communications specialists would make friendly conversation about weekend plans, television shows, and gossip about base personnel. Sofia participated politely, but her mind remained focused on the psychological patterns she was detecting in the voices of soldiers thousands of miles away who had no idea they were being analyzed by someone who understood them better than they understood themselves. "You take this job pretty seriously," observed Corporal Lisa Martinez, a communications specialist who worked the station next to Sofia's. "Most people treat monitoring duty as background noise after a few months. You listen like every transmission might contain state secrets." "Every transmission does contain important information," Sofia replied. "It's just not always in the words being spoken." Corporal Martinez looked puzzled by this response, but didn't pursue the conversation further. Sofia had learned to modulate her observations to avoid making colleagues uncomfortable, but she couldn't suppress her natural tendency to analyze the psychological content of everything she encountered. Her evenings were spent in the base library, researching military psychology journals and case studies of intelligence failures that might have been prevented by better understanding of human factors. She found extensive documentation of military disasters caused by commanders who were psychologically compromised but whose problems weren't identified until after they had made catastrophic decisions. The 1983 bombing of Marine barracks in Beirut had been partly attributed to security lapses by commanders who were showing signs of stress and decision fatigue that went unrecognized. Intelligence failures preceding the September 11th attacks had been linked to analyst burnout and interagency communication problems that could have been identified through psychological monitoring. More recently, several friendly fire incidents in Iraq and Afghanistan had been traced to unit commanders whose stress levels had compromised their judgment, but whose psychological state hadn't been assessed until after tragedy had occurred. Sofia realized she was developing capabilities that the military needed but didn't know how to utilize. Her emotional intelligence allowed her to identify psychological problems in military personnel before they became operational disasters. But the military's rigid departmentalization meant there was no mechanism for her insights to reach decision-makers who could act on them. 3 months into her assignment at Fort Sterling, Sofia had compiled psychological profiles on more than 50 military personnel whose communications she monitored. She had identified 12 individuals showing signs of serious stress, 3 whose decision-making patterns suggested they were dealing with undisclosed personal problems, and 5 whose communication changes indicated potential security risks that warranted investigation, but her files remained locked in her personal footlocker, her insights trapped by a system that valued her language skills while ignoring her psychological expertise. Sofia understood that she was exactly where the military wanted her, safely contained in a support role where her emotional intelligence couldn't challenge established protocols or disrupt operational efficiency. What they didn't understand was that Sofia had never intended to be contained. She was learning the system from the inside, developing relationships, and waiting for an opportunity to prove that the soldier they had dismissed as too emotional was actually the most strategically valuable asset they had never learned to use. Late at night, lying in her narrow bunk in the women's barracks, Sofia would stare at the ceiling and remind herself that this assignment was temporary. She was building credibility, demonstrating reliability, and positioning herself for the moment when her unique capabilities would become undeniably necessary. That moment was coming sooner than anyone expected. While her official duties kept Sofia tethered to a communications workstation 8 hours a day, her real education began during the evenings and weekends when Fort Sterling's operations shifted to skeleton crews and she could explore capabilities that extended far beyond radio monitoring and message translation. Sofia had discovered that Fort Sterling's library contained an extensive collection of classified military psychology research, including case studies from recent operations that weren't available to civilian researchers. With her security clearance and legitimate research interest, she gained access to after-action reports that detailed the psychological factors behind military successes and failures in unprecedented detail. The reports painted a disturbing picture of how psychological intelligence was being underutilized across all branches of military service. Operation Neptune Spear, the mission that killed Osama bin Laden, had succeeded partly because intelligence analysts had developed detailed psychological profiles of the compound's occupants, predicting their likely responses to different assault approaches. But similar psychological analysis had been absent from dozens of other operations that had failed due to inadequate understanding of enemy motivations, cultural factors, or human terrain considerations. Sofia began developing her own training program based on these classified insights. She created exercises that combined her communications monitoring duties with advanced psychological analysis, treating every transmission she processed as an opportunity to refine her ability to assess human factors under operational conditions. Her breakthrough came during a routine monitoring session in late January. Sofia was processing communications from a NATO peacekeeping operation in Kosovo when she detected something that made her pause the recording and listen more carefully. Captain Derek Morrison, the field commander she had been tracking for months, was conducting a standard logistics coordination call with his supply officer, but his vocal patterns indicated he was operating under extreme psychological stress. Conversation itself was unremarkable: requests for ammunition resupply, VEHICL, maintenance schedules, personnel rotation planning. But Morrison's voice carried micro-tremors that suggested sleep deprivation. His response timing indicated decreased cognitive processing, and his word choices revealed someone who was making decisions based on fear rather than tactical analysis. Sofia spent the next week creating a comprehensive psychological assessment of Captain Morrison's unit based entirely on communications analysis. She documented changes in radio discipline, shifts in informal communication patterns, and variations in decision-making speed that painted a picture of a peacekeeping unit under increasing psychological pressure despite the apparent calm of their operational environment. When she presented her analysis to Sergeant Rivers during their weekly review, her supervisor's response was predictably dismissive. Private Reyes, psychological evaluation of field personnel is handled by qualified military psychologists through proper channels. Our job is communications processing, not amateur psychology. But Sofia had anticipated this response. She had spent months learning the bureaucratic pathways at Fort Sterling, identifying personnel who might be receptive to unconventional approaches to intelligence analysis. Her target was Master Sergeant Linda Thompson, a career intelligence analyst who had served in Afghanistan and Iraq and had witnessed firsthand the consequences of inadequate human intelligence. Sofia approached Master Sergeant Thompson during a chance encounter at the base gym, where both women maintained evening workout routines that brought them into regular contact. Thompson was a compact, intense woman in her late 30s whose reputation for analytical excellence was matched by her willingness to challenge conventional wisdom when evidence supported alternative approaches. "Sergeant Thompson," Sofia began, during a pause between workout sets, "I'm working on some communications analysis that might have intelligence applications. Could I get your perspective on something?" Thompson studied Sofia with the careful attention of someone accustomed to evaluating information from unexpected sources. "What kind of communications analysis?" Sofia explained her work monitoring NATO peacekeeping operations and her observations about psychological patterns in field communications. She presented her assessment of Captain Morrison's unit with the precision of a formal intelligence briefing, complete with supporting evidence and predictive analysis. "You're telling me you can assess the psychological state of field personnel based solely on radio communications?" Thompson asked, her skepticism evident but not dismissive. "I can identify stress indicators, decision-making patterns, and unit cohesion factors that might not be apparent through conventional intelligence gathering," Sofia replied. "The information is all there in the communications, it's just not being analyzed from a psychological perspective." Thompson was quiet for several minutes, processing the implications of what Sofia was describing. As an experienced intelligence analyst, she understood the value of human intelligence that could predict behavioral patterns and identify developing problems before they became operational crises. "Show me your analysis of Morrison's unit," Thompson said finally. Over the next 2 hours, Sofia presented her comprehensive psychological assessment of the peacekeeping operation, explaining how she had identified patterns of increasing stress, declining unit cohesion, and leadership decision-making that suggested the unit was approaching a psychological breaking point. Despite the absence of obvious tactical problems, Thompson reviewed Sofia's documentation with the thoroughness of someone evaluating intelligence that might affect operational decisions. Her questions were precise and challenging, testing Sofia's methodology and the reliability of her conclusions. "This is extraordinary work," Thompson concluded. "You've identified psychological intelligence that our conventional analysis completely missed. If your assessment is accurate, Morrison's unit is vulnerable to exactly the kind of psychological collapse that led to several peacekeeping failures in the Balkans during the 1990s. Preparing and narrating this story took us a lot of time, so if you are enjoying it, subscribe to our channel. It means a lot to us. Now back to the story. Thompson's validation was the first official recognition Sofia had received for her psychological intelligence capabilities, but more importantly, it opened a pathway for her insights to reach decision-makers who could act on them. Thompson began meeting with Sofia weekly, reviewing her communications analysis and discussing how psychological intelligence could be integrated into formal intelligence assessment procedures. The military has always understood that psychological factors affect operational outcomes, Thompson explained during one of their sessions. What we've never had is a systematic method for gathering and analyzing psychological intelligence in real time. Your approach could change how we assess and respond to developing situations. Under Thompson's mentorship, Sofia began expanding her psychological analysis beyond communications monitoring. She studied classified reports on military psychology research, attended intelligence briefings where her insights might be relevant, and began developing theoretical frameworks for integrating emotional intelligence into operational planning. Her unofficial training program became increasingly sophisticated. Sofia created exercises that combined psychological analysis with tactical decision-making, testing her ability to predict human behavior under various operational scenarios. She practiced rapid psychological assessment techniques, learning to evaluate personnel and situations with the speed and accuracy required for real-time intelligence applications. Thompson arranged for Sofia to observe intelligence analysis sessions where psychological factors were relevant to operational planning. These experiences gave Sofia exposure to how intelligence was gathered, analyzed, and presented to decision-makers, while also revealing the gaps where psychological intelligence could provide crucial insights. Most intelligence analysis focuses on capabilities and intentions, Thompson observed during one of their training sessions. We're excellent at determining what enemies can do and what they appear to be planning, but we're much less effective at predicting what they will actually do when psychological pressure, cultural factors, and human emotions come into play. Sofia absorbed these lessons while continuing to develop her unique combination of psychological expertise and military operational understanding. She was becoming something that didn't exist in military occupational specialty classifications: a soldier who could analyze human terrain with the same precision that others applied to geographic terrain. Her communications monitoring duties became a cover for increasingly sophisticated psychological intelligence gathering. Sofia was no longer just processing radio transmissions. She was conducting real-time psychological assessment of military personnel across multiple theaters of operation, building a comprehensive understanding of human factors that affected military effectiveness. But her most important development was learning to present her insights in ways that aligned with military decision-making processes. Sofia practiced translating psychological analysis into operational recommendations, framing her emotional intelligence insights as tactical advantages rather than therapeutic interventions. By spring, Sofia had become an unofficial specialist in psychological intelligence, with capabilities that extended far beyond her official job description. Master Sergeant Thompson had begun consulting her on intelligence assessments that involved human factors and her psychological insights were quietly influencing operational decisions at levels she wasn't officially authorized to access. Sofia understood that she was developing into exactly the kind of soldier the military had said it didn't need. Someone whose emotional intelligence could predict and prevent the human failures that conventional intelligence analysis couldn't identify. She was preparing for opportunities that didn't yet exist, building capabilities for missions that hadn't been imagined. The test of those capabilities was approaching, faster than anyone realized. Master Sergeant Linda Thompson had been analyzing intelligence for 17 years, and she had never encountered anyone with Sofia's combination of analytical precision and psychological intuition. What began as informal mentoring sessions had evolved into something that resembled advanced training for a military specialty that didn't officially exist. Thompson's office in the intelligence wing of Fort Sterling had become Sofia's unofficial second workplace. The walls were covered with maps, operational charts, and classified briefing materials from current and recent military operations. It was here that Sofia learned to translate her psychological insights into the language of military intelligence and operational planning. Intelligence analysis is fundamentally about prediction, Thompson explained during one of their evening sessions. We gather information about enemy capabilities, analyze their past behavior, and try to predict their future actions. But most intelligence focuses on what people can do and what they appear to be planning. Your approach adds a crucial third dimension, what they will actually do when human psychology comes into play. Sofia had brought her latest analysis of communications from the Kosovo peacekeeping operation, including updated assessments of Captain Morrison's unit and several other NATO forces operating in the region. Her documentation had become increasingly sophisticated, incorporating not just psychological analysis of individual personnel, but broader assessments of unit cohesion, cultural tensions, and leadership dynamics that might affect operational effectiveness. Thompson reviewed Sofia's work with the meticulous attention she applied to all intelligence materials. Over the past months, she had learned to trust Sofia's psychological assessments with the same confidence she placed in satellite imagery or signal intercepts. Sofia's predictions about personnel behavior had proven accurate with remarkable consistency. Your assessment of Morrison's unit has been confirmed by recent developments, Thompson said, showing Sofia classified reports that had arrived that morning. He requested emergency psychological evaluation for 3 of his soldiers last week, and he's been asking for early rotation out of his command position. Everything you predicted based on communications analysis has been happening exactly as you described. Sofia felt a mixture of satisfaction and concern. Her psychological intelligence had been accurate, but accuracy meant that soldiers were suffering from stress and psychological problems that could have been addressed earlier if her insights had been taken seriously by command structures. What's more significant, Thompson continued, is that your methodology is identifying patterns that our conventional intelligence completely missed. Morrison's unit appeared stable and effective according to all standard metrics, but your analysis revealed underlying psychological factors that were making them vulnerable to exactly the kind of breakdown they're now experiencing. Thompson opened a secure folder containing materials Sofia had never seen before. Psychological intelligence assessments from recent military operations, where human factors had played crucial roles in mission outcomes. The documents detailed situations where accurate psychological analysis could have prevented operational failures, and cases where inadequate understanding of human terrain had led to strategic disasters. I've been sharing your work with Colonel Patricia Hawkins, the base intelligence commander, Thompson said. She's been impressed by your analysis, and she's beginning to understand the operational value of psychological intelligence capabilities. Sofia felt her pulse quicken. Colonel Hawkins was several levels above her in the command structure, and her recognition could mean the difference between continuing as an unofficial analyst and gaining formal opportunities to apply her skills. Colonel Hawkins has asked me to evaluate whether your capabilities could be applied to current operational challenges. Thompson continued. We're facing intelligence problems where psychological analysis might provide crucial insights that conventional methods haven't been able to develop. Thompson explained that military intelligence was struggling with several ongoing situations where human factors were more important than traditional tactical considerations. Hostage negotiations where understanding the psychological state of captors could determine life or death outcomes. Counterinsurgency operations where predicting civilian population responses could affect the success of entire campaigns. Diplomatic missions where reading the psychological dynamics between international leaders could influence strategic policy decisions. The military has always acknowledged that psychological factors matter, Thompson said, but we've never had systematic methods for gathering and analyzing psychological intelligence with the precision we apply to other forms of intelligence. Gathering, your approach could fill that gap. Over the following weeks, Thompson began integrating Sofia into intelligence operations that went far beyond her official communications duties. Sofia attended briefings on current military operations, reviewed classified materials on ongoing diplomatic negotiations, and provided psychological analysis for situations where human factors were critical to mission success. Her first formal intelligence assessment involved analyzing video footage of a failed hostage rescue operation in Syria, where American special forces had been unable to predict the behavior of hostage-takers during a tactical assault. Sofia reviewed the available intelligence materials and provided a psychological profile that explained why the captors had responded differently than intelligence analysts had predicted. The conventional analysis focused on the captors' stated political motivations and assumed they would behave rationally according to their declared objectives, Sofia explained during her briefing to Colonel Hawkins and her intelligence staff. But psychological analysis of their communications and behavior patterns revealed they were primarily motivated by personal desperation rather than political ideology. This meant they were more likely to make unpredictable decisions based on emotional responses rather than strategic calculations. Colonel Hawkins was a career intelligence officer whose skepticism about unconventional approaches was balanced by her recognition that conventional intelligence had significant limitations. She questioned Sofia extensively about her methodology, the reliability of her conclusions, and the practical applications of psychological intelligence in operational planning. Private Reyes, Colonel Hawkins said after reviewing Sofia's assessment, your analysis explains behavioral patterns that our standard intelligence evaluation completely missed. If your insights had been available during the planning phase of that operation, we might have been able to predict and prevent the tactical mistakes that led to mission failure. The validation from Colonel Hawkins represented a turning point in Sofia's unofficial military career. She was no longer just a communications specialist with interesting psychological insights. She was becoming recognized as someone whose unique capabilities could contribute to mission success in ways that conventional military training couldn't match. Thompson began arranging for Sofia to participate in intelligence operations with increasing responsibility and complexity. She provided psychological analysis for diplomatic negotiations, assessed the reliability of intelligence sources based on behavioral indicators, and developed psychological profiles of enemy personnel that helped predict their likely responses to military pressure. You're developing capabilities that don't exist in any military occupational specialty, Thompson observed during one of their training sessions. The closest official equivalent would be military psychology or intelligence analysis, but your approach combines elements from both fields with psychological insights that neither specialty typically develops. Sofia understood that she was creating a new category of military service through her combination of emotional intelligence and operational analysis. She was proving that the psychological skills that had been considered incompatible with military requirements were actually essential capabilities that the military had been missing. But she also recognized that her unofficial status made her influence limited and precarious. Her insights were valuable when they supported successful operations, but she had no formal authority or protection if her unconventional approaches led to controversial or unsuccessful outcomes. "Master Sergeant Thompson," Sofia said during one of their evening sessions, "I appreciate the opportunities you've given me to develop and apply these capabilities. But I'm concerned that my unofficial status limits how effectively I can contribute to operations where psychological intelligence might be crucial." Thompson nodded thoughtfully. She had been considering the same issue, recognizing that Sofia's talents were being underutilized because there was no formal framework for integrating psychological intelligence into military operations. "I've been discussing that exact problem with Colonel Hawkins," Thompson replied. "We're beginning to understand that your capabilities represent something the military needs, but doesn't know how to classify or utilize. The question is whether we can create opportunities for you to apply your skills in situations where they can have maximum impact on mission success." Sofia felt the familiar sensation of being evaluated and assessed, but this time the evaluation was being conducted by people who understood the value of her capabilities rather than fearing their implications. Thompson and Colonel Hawkins were not trying to contain her emotional intelligence. They were trying to find ways to weaponize it for operational advantage. The opportunity to prove the strategic value of psychological intelligence was approaching, though none of them realized that it would arrive in the form of the military's most impossible mission, a situation where conventional approaches had failed completely, and Sofia's unique capabilities would become the difference between catastrophic failure and unprecedented success. The atmosphere at Fort Sterling began changing in early March, with subtle indicators that Sofia's psychological training had taught her to recognize immediately. Senior officers were conducting more frequent secure communications, intelligence. Briefings were being held behind closed doors with increased security protocols, and the general tension level among base personnel had elevated in ways that suggested something significant was developing. Sofia noticed the changes first in the communications she monitored from field operations. The routine peacekeeping missions in the Balkans were being supplemented by increased intelligence gathering activities, with field commanders requesting information about civilian population movements, political tensions, and potential security threats that exceeded normal peacekeeping parameters. More telling were the changes in communication patterns from higher command levels. Sofia had learned to analyze not just the content of military communications, but the psychological patterns of the personnel conducting them. Senior officers who normally maintained calm, professional demeanors were showing stress indicators in their radio transmissions, slightly faster speech patterns, increased use of formal protocols that suggested they were operating under pressure, and subtle changes in decision-making speed that indicated they were dealing with complex, time-sensitive situations. "Something big is developing," Sofia observed during one of her weekly sessions with Master Sergeant Thompson. "The psychological patterns in command-level communications suggest we're preparing for operations that go beyond routine peacekeeping or intelligence gathering." Thompson had been monitoring the same indicators through conventional intelligence channels, but Sofia's psychological analysis provided insights that weren't available through traditional assessment methods. "What kind of psychological patterns are you detecting?" Sofia opened her analysis files, which had grown to include psychological profiles of dozens of military personnel across multiple command levels and operational theaters. The stress indicators suggest we're dealing with a situation that involves American personnel in immediate danger, probably a hostage situation or failed mission where conventional rescue approaches haven't been successful. The communication patterns indicate that multiple agencies are involved: military, intelligence, and probably diplomatic, which suggests international implications. Thompson studied Sofia's documentation with the careful attention she applied to all intelligence materials. Over the past months, she had learned that Sofia's psychological insights often provided advance warning of operational developments that conventional intelligence detected only after they had become obvious to everyone else. Colonel Hawkins has been in secure communications with Pentagon officials for the past week, Thompson confirmed. Whatever is developing, it's at the highest levels of military command, and it's requiring capabilities that our standard operational procedures haven't been able to provide. Sofia felt the familiar sensation of being on the periphery of important events, possessing insights that might be crucial, but lacking official channels to apply them effectively. Her psychological intelligence had proven valuable for analyzing past operations and predicting behavioral patterns in routine situations, but she had never been tested in real-time crisis situations where her insights could directly affect life or death. Outcomes. The breakthrough came during a routine communications monitoring session when Sofia intercepted a fragment of encrypted transmission that had been improperly routed through standard communication channels. The transmission lasted less than 30 seconds before being cut off and rerouted through secure networks, but Sofia had been able to record and analyze the brief segment of conversation. The voices belonged to high-ranking military officials discussing what appeared to be a failed rescue operation involving American hostages. Sofia couldn't identify the specific location or circumstances, but the psychological content of the conversation revealed crucial information about the nature of the crisis. The primary speaker was exhibiting extreme frustration combined with desperation, Sofia explained to Thompson during an emergency meeting she had requested. His vocal patterns indicated someone who had exhausted conventional options and was under enormous pressure to find alternative solutions. The secondary voice showed resignation and defeat, someone who believed the situation was hopeless. Thompson listened with increasing interest as Sofia provided a detailed psychological analysis of the intercepted conversation. What else could you determine from the fragment? The crisis involves multiple American hostages in a situation where direct military intervention has already failed, Sofia continued. The captors are not responding to conventional negotiation tactics, and time pressure suggests the hostages are in immediate danger. Most importantly, the psychological profiles of the officials discussing the situation indicate they're looking for unconventional approaches because everything else has been unsuccessful. Thompson realized that Sofia had just provided intelligence insights that conventional analysis would have missed entirely. The fragment of conversation that would have been dismissed as routine administrative communication contained psychological information that revealed the scope and urgency of whatever crisis was developing. Sofia, this analysis suggests you might have insights that could be relevant to whatever operation is being planned, Thompson said. Your psychological intelligence capabilities might be exactly what they need for a situation where conventional approaches have failed. Over the following days, the indicators of crisis escalated dramatically. Fort Sterling's intelligence wing began operating on extended hours, with senior officers conducting secure briefings and emergency planning sessions that excluded most base personnel. Sofia's communications monitoring duties expanded to include encrypted transmissions that required her highest-level security clearance, suggesting she was being positioned for involvement in whatever operation was developing. Colonel Hawkins summoned Sofia for a private briefing that took place in a secure conference room she had never seen before. The walls were lined with maps of regions Sofia couldn't identify, and the table was covered with classified documents that had been redacted so heavily they appeared almost entirely black. Private Reyes, Colonel Hawkins began, her voice carrying the controlled tension of someone operating under extreme pressure. We have a situation where your psychological analysis capabilities might be essential to mission success. I need to Know if you're prepared to apply your skills to an operational crisis where failure could result in the deaths of American personnel. Sofia felt her pulse accelerate, but her voice remained steady. Ma'am, I'm prepared to serve in whatever capacity my abilities can contribute to mission success. Colonel Hawkins studied Sofia with the careful assessment of someone making decisions that could affect national security. What I'm about to tell you is classified at the highest levels. We have American hostages in a situation where every conventional rescue and negotiation approach has failed. The hostage takers are not responding to traditional pressure, and we're running out of time before the situation becomes catastrophic. Sofia absorbed this information while maintaining her professional composure, though internally she felt the magnitude of what was being asked of her. This was not an academic exercise or a training scenario. This was a real crisis where her psychological intelligence might determine whether American lives were saved or lost. The hostage takers appear to be motivated by factors that are standard intelligence analysis hasn't been able to identify, Colonel Hawkins continued. We need someone who can analyze their psychological state, predict their behavior, and potentially identify approaches for resolving the crisis that conventional methods haven't considered. Sofia understood that she was being offered the opportunity she had been preparing for since her rejection from special operations training. This was her chance to prove that psychological intelligence wasn't a liability in military operations. It was a crucial capability that could succeed where conventional approaches had failed. Ma'am, I believe my psychological analysis capabilities could provide insights that might be essential for understanding and resolving this crisis, Sofia replied. I'm ready to contribute whatever assistance my training and abilities can provide. Colonel Hawkins nodded with the grim satisfaction of someone who had found a potential solution to an impossible problem. Private Reyes, you're about to be assigned to the most classified operation currently being conducted by the United States military. Your psychological intelligence is going to be tested under conditions where failure is not an option. As Sofia left the briefing room, she carried with her the weight of knowing that everything she had trained for was about to be tested in the most critical circumstances imaginable. The military's hardest mission was about to become her opportunity to prove that the soldier they had called too emotional was actually their best hope for success when emotions and human psychology became the most important weapons on the battlefield. The Secure Operations Center in the basement of Fort Sterling's intelligence building had been transformed into a 24-hour command hub that Sofia had never seen before. Banks of monitors displayed satellite imagery. Encrypted communications terminals connected directly to Pentagon command centers, and maps covered every available wall space with markings that indicated a crisis of international scope. Sofia entered the operations center at 0600 hours on March 15th, carrying her psychological analysis equipment and the security clearance that had just been elevated to levels she hadn't known existed. The room contained a dozen personnel from various military and intelligence agencies, all focused on resolving what she was about to learn was the most complex hostage crisis in recent American military history. Colonel Hawkins stood at the center of the operations hub, coordinating communications with multiple command centers while reviewing intelligence reports that arrived continuously through secure channels. When she noticed Sofia's arrival, she gestured toward a briefing area where classified materials had been prepared for her initial orientation. Private Reyes, welcome to Operation Mindbridge, Colonel Hawkins began, using the code name that Sofia immediately understood referred to her psychological intelligence capabilities. What I'm about to brief you on represents one of the most challenging situations American forces have faced in the past decade. The briefing materials contained photographs, intelligence reports, and communication transcripts that revealed the full scope of the crisis. 6 American humanitarian workers had been captured 3 weeks earlier while conducting medical relief operations in a remote region of eastern Afghanistan. The hostage-takers were a previously unknown group that appeared to combine elements of religious extremism, tribal loyalty, and personal vendettas in ways that conventional intelligence analysis couldn't untangle. Every standard approach to hostage resolution has been attempted and failed, Colonel Hawkins explained. Direct military rescue operations have been unsuccessful due to the terrain and the captors' defensive positions. Diplomatic negotiations have been ineffective because we can't identify what the hostage-takers actually want. Traditional intelligence gathering has failed to provide actionable insights about their motivations or likely behavior. Sofia studied the available materials with the systematic approach she had learned from Master Sergeant Thompson. But this time the analysis wasn't academic. 6 American lives depended on her ability to understand human psychology under the most extreme circumstances imaginable. The hostage-takers were led by a man identified only as Commander Rashid, whose background combined military training from the Soviet occupation era, religious education from various extremist sources, and personal experiences that appeared to include significant trauma and loss. Conventional intelligence had developed basic biographical information, but couldn't explain why he had chosen to target American humanitarian workers or what conditions might lead to the hostages' release. The psychological profile we've developed through standard methods suggests he's motivated primarily by anti-American sentiment and religious extremism, explained Major David Chun, the intelligence officer who had been coordinating the crisis response. But our negotiations based on those assumptions have been completely unsuccessful. He's not responding to offers that should appeal to those motivations. Sofia reviewed the communication transcripts from attempted negotiations, analyzing not just the content of Commander Rashid's statements, but the psychological patterns revealed in his language choices, emotional responses, and behavioral indicators. What she discovered contradicted the conventional intelligence assessment in fundamental ways. Major Chun, I believe the psychological analysis of Commander Rashid has been based on incorrect assumptions, Sofia said after completing her initial review. His communication patterns don't indicate someone primarily motivated by political or religious ideology. The psychological markers suggest he's operating from personal trauma and a need for recognition that has nothing to do with broader extremist objectives. Major Chun looked skeptical. Private Reyes, our intelligence assessment is based on his documented associations with extremist groups and his stated religious and political motivations. With respect, sir, what people say about their motivations and what actually drives their behavior are often completely different, Sofia replied. The psychological content of his communications reveals someone who feels powerless and ignored, who has chosen hostage-taking as a way to force attention and acknowledgement rather than to advance ideological goals. Sofia spent the next several hours conducting the comprehensive psychological analysis of every available communication from Commander Rashid, including ransom demands, propaganda statements, and negotiation responses. Her findings painted a psychological portrait that was completely different from the intelligence profile that had guided all previous rescue and negotiation attempts. Commander Rashid is not a traditional extremist leader, Sofia explained during her briefing to the crisis response team. He's a traumatized individual who has constructed an extremist identity as a way to cope with personal losses and gain a sense of power and importance. His primary psychological need is not ideological validation, it's personal recognition and respect. The implications of Sofia's analysis were significant for rescue planning. If Commander Rashid was motivated by personal psychological needs rather than ideological objectives, then negotiation approaches that addressed his need for recognition and respect might be more effective than tactics designed to counter religious or political extremism. This analysis suggests completely different approaches to resolving the crisis, observed Lieutenant Colonel Sarah Martinez, the Special Operations Planner who was coordinating potential rescue scenarios. If his motivation is personal recognition, Rather than ideological advancement, we might be able to appeal to psychological needs that conventional negotiation hasn't addressed. But Sofia's psychological intelligence revealed an even more critical insight. Her analysis of the communication patterns suggested that Commander Rashid was operating under increasing psychological pressure, with indicators that pointed toward a potential psychological breakdown that could result in violence against the hostages. The psychological markers in his most recent communications indicate deteriorating mental stability, Sofia explained. His need for recognition is being frustrated by the failure of his hostage-taking to generate the attention and respect he's seeking. Without intervention that addresses his psychological state, he's likely to escalate to violence within the next 48 to 72 hours. The Operations Center fell silent as the implications of Sofia's assessment became clear. Not only had conventional approaches failed to resolve the crisis, but continued failure to understand and address Commander Rashid's psychological state could result in the execution of American hostages within days. Colonel Hawkins studied Sofia's analysis with the intense focus of someone whose decisions would determine whether the crisis ended in successful rescue or catastrophic failure. Private Reyes, if your psychological assessment is accurate, what approaches would you recommend for resolving this situation? Sofia felt the weight of 6 American lives resting on her ability to translate psychological intelligence into operational recommendations. Everything she had learned about human behavior, military psychology, and crisis intervention was about to be tested under conditions where mistakes would be measured in human casualties. Ma'am, I believe successful resolution requires an approach that addresses Commander Rashid's psychological needs while creating conditions for hostage release, Sofia replied. This means developing communication strategies that provide him with the recognition and respect he's seeking, while simultaneously creating psychological pressure that makes hostage release seem like his idea rather than a concession to American demands. Colonel Hawkins exchanged glances with the other senior officers in the Operations Center. Sofia's recommendations represented a completely different approach from anything they had attempted, but conventional methods had failed completely, and time was running out. Private Reyes, Colonel Hawkins said finally, you're about to be assigned to direct participation in hostage negotiations with Commander Rashid. Your psychological intelligence is going to be applied in real time to communications with a hostile actor whose behavior could determine whether American hostages live or die. Sofia felt a mixture of terror and determination as she realized that her theoretical training in psychological intelligence was about to become the primary tool for resolving the military's most impossible mission. The soldier they had called too emotional was about to prove that understanding emotions was the most powerful weapon available when human psychology became the battlefield. The secure communications booth in Fort Sterling's Operations Center had been modified with recording equipment, psychological monitoring devices, and direct satellite links that would allow Sofia to conduct real-time negotiations with Commander Rashid while intelligence analysts tracked every aspect of the conversation for tactical insights. Sofia sat in the booth at 1400 hours on March 16th, wearing a headset that connected her directly to the hostage location in Afghanistan, while simultaneously linking her to psychological analysis equipment that would monitor her own stress levels and decision-making capabilities during the negotiations. Everything she had learned about human psychology, military operations, and crisis intervention was about to be tested in a conversation where mistakes could result in the execution of 6 American hostages. Colonel Hawkins stood in the observation area with Master Sergeant Thompson and a team of intelligence analysts who would provide real-time support during the negotiation. The atmosphere in the Operations Center was tense with the controlled urgency of people who understood they were attempting something that had never been tried before, using psychological intelligence as the primary weapon for hostage rescue. Private Reyes, Colonel Hawkins said through the communication system, You are authorized to conduct negotiations with Commander Rashid, using whatever psychological approaches you believe will be most effective. You have complete tactical authority. For this conversation, with the understanding that 6 American lives depend on your ability to apply your psychological training under operational conditions. Sofia activated the communication link that would connect her directly to Commander Rashid's location. Her psychological analysis had suggested that he was operating from a need for recognition and respect, combined with trauma-based decision-making. That made him unpredictable according to conventional negotiation models. Her approach would need to address his psychological state while creating conditions that made hostage release seem advantageous to his personal objectives. The voice that came through her headset was exactly what Sofia had expected based on her psychological analysis, controlled but carrying undertones of stress, desperation, and a deep need for validation that conventional negotiations had failed to recognize. "This is Commander Rashid. I am told that Americans wish to negotiate for the release of the medical workers." Sofia took a deep breath and applied everything she had learned about psychological influence under extreme conditions. Her voice needed to convey respect and recognition without suggesting weakness, while simultaneously gathering psychological intelligence that would guide the negotiation toward successful resolution. "Commander Rashid, this is Sofia Reyes. I'm calling because your actions have attracted the attention of senior American military officials who recognize that you are someone who cannot be ignored or dismissed." The slight pause before Commander Rashid's response told Sofia that her opening approach had been psychologically effective. She had immediately addressed his primary need for recognition while positioning herself as someone authorized to provide the respect and attention he was seeking. "You speak as if you understand more than the others who have attempted to negotiate," Commander Rashid replied, his voice carrying curiosity mixed with suspicion. Sofia had anticipated this response based on her analysis of his psychological profile. Commander Rashid had been frustrated by previous negotiations that had treated him as a common criminal or ideological extremist rather than recognizing the complexity of his motivations and the personal trauma that was driving his behavior. "I understand that you are not motivated by the same objectives that drive most people who take hostages," Sofia replied. "I understand that your actions reflect experiences and losses that others have not bothered to recognize or respect." Over the next 2 hours, Sofia conducted the most sophisticated psychological negotiation in military history. She applied her emotional intelligence to understand Commander Rashid's mental state in real time, adjusting her approach based on subtle changes in his voice, response patterns, and emotional indicators that revealed his psychological needs and vulnerabilities. The breakthrough came when Sofia recognized that Commander Rashid's hostage-taking was fundamentally a cry for help from someone who had experienced trauma and loss that he couldn't process through conventional means. His construction of an extremist identity was a psychological defense mechanism that allowed him to feel powerful and important after experiencing profound powerlessness. "Commander Rashid, I believe you have experienced losses that most people cannot understand," Sofia said, drawing on her analysis of his psychological markers. "I believe you have seen your community, your family, your way of life destroyed by forces beyond your control, and that taking these hostages represents your attempt to regain some sense of power and significance." The silence that followed was longer than any previous pause in their conversation. Sofia could sense through her psychological training that she had identified the core trauma that was driving Commander Rashid's behavior, the psychological wound that conventional intelligence had missed entirely. "You speak of things that others do not see," Commander Rashid replied, his voice carrying emotional undertones that revealed Sofia had reached his genuine psychological state rather than the extremist persona he had constructed for protection. Sofia pressed her psychological advantage while maintaining the respect and recognition that his traumatized psyche required. I see someone who has been forced to watch helplessly while everything he cared about was destroyed, and who has chosen this action as a way to prove that he cannot be ignored or dismissed as unimportant. The conversation continued for another hour, with Sofia applying psychological techniques that addressed Commander Rashid's need for recognition while gradually creating conditions where releasing the hostages would allow him to maintain dignity and demonstrate his power through mercy, rather than violence. "The medical workers you are holding," Sofia said during the crucial phase of the negotiation, "are people who came to your region to help heal suffering, just as you are trying to heal your own suffering through these actions. Releasing them would demonstrate that you are powerful enough to show mercy to those who were trying to help your people." Sofia was reframing the hostage release from a concession to American demands into a demonstration of Commander Rashid's own power and moral authority. Her psychological intelligence allowed her to understand that his traumatized psyche needed to feel that any decision to release hostages was his choice, motivated by his own objectives rather than submission to external pressure. "You suggest that releasing the medical workers would demonstrate my power rather than my weakness?" Commander Rashid asked, his voice carrying the first indication that he was considering alternatives to violence. "I suggest that anyone can kill helpless people," Sofia replied, applying psychological pressure that appealed to his need for recognition as someone exceptional. "But only someone with genuine power and moral authority can choose mercy when he has the capability for violence. That kind of strength cannot be ignored or dismissed by anyone." The silence that followed was the longest of the entire negotiation. Sofia waited, monitoring her own psychological state while using her emotional intelligence to assess Commander Rashid's decision-making process through subtle audio cues that revealed his internal struggle between his constructed extremist identity and his deeper human psychology. "Sofia Reyes," Commander Rashid finally said, using her name for the first time during the negotiation, "you have spoken to me as someone who understands rather than someone who judges. This is unusual in my experience with Americans." Sofia felt her pulse accelerate as she recognized that the negotiation had reached its critical moment. Commander Rashid was revealing his authentic psychological state rather than his defensive extremist persona, which meant her psychological intelligence had successfully penetrated the barriers that had made conventional negotiations impossible. "Commander Rashid," Sofia replied, "I believe you are someone who has been shaped by circumstances rather than someone who is inherently violent. I believe you have the strength to make decisions that demonstrate your true character rather than the character that circumstances have forced you to adopt." The final phase of the negotiation took another 90 minutes, with Sofia using every aspect of her psychological training to guide Commander Rashid toward a decision that would satisfy his need for recognition and respect while resulting in the safe release of the American hostages. When Commander Rashid finally agreed to release the hostages in exchange for safe passage and international recognition of his grievances, Sofia felt the exhaustion and relief of someone who had just applied years of training to the most critical test imaginable and succeeded where every conventional approach had failed. The operations center at Fort Sterling erupted in controlled celebration as confirmation came through secure channels that all 6 American hostages had been released unharmed and were in the custody of U.S. forces. Sofia remained in the communications booth, monitoring the final phases of the exchange, while intelligence analysts documented every aspect of the successful negotiation for future psychological operations training. Colonel Hawkins stood behind Sofia's position, watching the real-time intelligence feeds that showed the hostages being transported to safety by helicopter, while Commander Rashid and his followers departed under the safe passage agreement that Sofia's psychological negotiation had made possible. For the first time in 3 weeks, American personnel who had been facing certain death were returning home to their families. Private Reyes, Colonel Hawkins said as Sofia removed her headset and began shutting down the communication equipment. You have just accomplished something that our best negotiators, intelligence analysts, and special operations personnel were unable to achieve. Your psychological intelligence succeeded in resolving a crisis that had been declared unsolvable by conventional methods. Sofia felt the magnitude of what had just occurred, but her psychological training also made her aware of the broader implications beyond the immediate success. She had proven that emotional intelligence wasn't a liability in military operations. It was a strategic capability that could succeed where traditional approaches failed entirely. Master Sergeant Thompson approached with a secure folder containing preliminary analysis of the negotiation, transcripts, and psychological assessment data that had been recorded during Sofia's conversation with Commander Rashid. The documentation would become the foundation for developing new military protocols for psychological operations and crisis resolution. Sofia, your psychological analysis was not only accurate, it was operationally decisive, Thompson said, reviewing the preliminary reports. Every prediction you made about Commander Rashid's behavior proved correct, and your psychological approach succeeded in changing his decision-making from violence toward negotiated resolution. The success of Operation Mindbridge had immediate implications that extended far beyond the rescue of 6 American hostages. Sofia's demonstration that psychological intelligence could be applied as a primary tactical tool in crisis situations represented a fundamental shift in how the military understood the role of emotional intelligence in operational planning. Over the next 72 hours, Sofia participated in extensive debriefing sessions where intelligence analysts, military psychologists, and special operations planners documented every aspect of her psychological approach for integration into future military training programs. Her methods were analyzed, systematized, and prepared for distribution to personnel who might face similar crisis situations. What made your approach successful where conventional negotiations failed? Asked Dr. Amanda Foster, a military psychologist who had been brought in from the Pentagon to evaluate the psychological techniques Sofia had applied during the hostage negotiation. Sofia had been thinking about this question since the successful conclusion of the crisis. Her psychological intelligence had succeeded, not because she had special techniques or superior training, but because she had been willing to understand and address the human emotions that conventional military thinking typically ignored or suppressed. Conventional negotiation approaches treated Commander Rashid as a tactical problem to be solved, rather than as a human being whose behavior was driven by psychological needs. Sofia explained, "My approach succeeded because I addressed his emotional state and psychological motivations, instead of just responding to his tactical demands." Dr. Foster documented Sofia's insights as part of a comprehensive analysis that would influence how the military trained personnel for psychological operations, crisis negotiation, and cultural intelligence gathering. Sofia's success had demonstrated that emotional intelligence could be systematically developed and applied as a military capability, rather than treated as an unpredictable personal trait. The Pentagon's response to Operation Mindbridge was swift and significant. Within a week of the successful hostage rescue, Sofia received orders transferring her to a newly created position in the Department of Defense's Psychological Operations Command, with a promotion to staff sergeant and authorization to develop training programs based on her successful crisis resolution techniques. But the most meaningful recognition came from an unexpected source: Dr. Richard Stone, the military psychologist who had classified Sofia as too emotional during her initial evaluation, requested a meeting to discuss her operational success and its implications for military psychological assessment procedures. Staff Sergeant Reyes, Dr. Stone began during their private meeting, "I owe you an apology. My evaluation of your psychological profile was based on outdated assumptions about the role of emotional intelligence in military operations. Your success in Operation Mindbridge has demonstrated that what I classified as a liability was actually an exceptional strategic capability. Sofia appreciated Dr. Stone's recognition, but she was more interested in ensuring that future soldiers with similar psychological profiles wouldn't face the same barriers she had encountered. Dr. Stone, I hope this success can help the military recognize that emotional intelligence and psychological sensitivity can be developed into tactical advantages rather than treated as disqualifying characteristics. Dr. Stone nodded in agreement. He had been tasked with revising military psychological evaluation procedures to identify and develop emotional intelligence capabilities rather than screening them out. Sofia's success had proven that the military's approach to psychological assessment needed fundamental changes to avoid eliminating personnel whose unique capabilities could be strategically valuable. The media coverage of the successful hostage rescue was carefully controlled to protect operational security, but within military circles, Sofia's achievement became legendary. She had proven that psychological intelligence could accomplish what conventional military power couldn't, and her methods were being studied and adapted for future operations requiring similar capabilities. Captain Jake Morrison, whose peacekeeping unit Sofia had been monitoring through communications analysis, sent a personal message thanking her for the psychological insights that had helped his soldiers address stress and unit cohesion problems before they became operational crises. Her early analysis had prevented several potential incidents that could have compromised mission effectiveness. Staff Sergeant Reyes, Captain Morrison wrote, "Your psychological intelligence capabilities saved more than just the hostages in Afghanistan. Your analysis of my unit's communications helped us identify and address problems that could have led to serious consequences if they had gone unrecognized." Sofia realized that her success in Operation Mindbridge was not an isolated achievement. It was the culmination of years of applying psychological intelligence to military operations in ways that had prevented numerous smaller crises and improved operational effectiveness across multiple missions. The formal recognition ceremony took place at the Pentagon, where Sofia received the Defense Superior Service Medal for her role in Operation Mindbridge. Secretary of Defense Patricia Williams presented the award in a private ceremony attended by senior military officials who were implementing changes based on Sofia's psychological operations methods. Staff Sergeant Reyes, Secretary Williams, said during the presentation, "Your success has demonstrated that the military's most powerful weapons are not always the most obvious ones. Your psychological intelligence succeeded where conventional approaches failed, and your methods are now being integrated into military training programs that will enhance our capabilities for decades to come." But for Sofia, the most significant recognition came in the form of the new military occupational specialty that was being created based on her capabilities, psychological operations specialist, with requirements that specifically valued emotional intelligence, cultural sensitivity, and the ability to understand and influence human behavior under operational conditions. The same psychological traits that had been classified as incompatible with military service were now being identified as essential qualifications for personnel who would follow in Sofia's path. The military had learned that soldiers who were too emotional might actually be exactly what modern operations required. As Sofia stood in the Pentagon, receiving recognition for accomplishing the impossible, she thought about the 7-year-old girl who had dreamed of using her gift to protect people, and the young woman who had been told that her emotional intelligence made her unsuitable for military service. She had proven that understanding people wasn't a weakness. It was the most powerful weapon available when human psychology became the battlefield. The soldier they had called too emotional had saved 6 American lives and changed how the military understood the strategic value of emotional intelligence. And she was just getting started. 6 months after Operation Mindbridge, The Psychological Operations Training Center at Fort Bragg, North Carolina, had become the most innovative military education facility in the United States. Sofia stood in the main briefing room, wearing the uniform of a newly promoted technical sergeant, addressing a class of 30 officers and enlisted personnel who were learning to apply emotional intelligence as a tactical capability. The students came from every branch of military service and represented a fundamental shift in how the Department of Defense recruited and trained personnel for psychological operations. Instead of screening out candidates who showed high emotional intelligence, the military now actively sought soldiers whose psychological sensitivity could be developed into strategic advantages. Emotional intelligence is not about being soft or sympathetic, Sofia explained to her students during the Advanced Psychological Assessment course. It's about understanding human behavior with sufficient precision to predict responses, influence decisions, and achieve operational objectives through psychological rather than conventional means. The training program Sofia had developed was based entirely on real-world applications of psychological intelligence in military contexts. Students analyzed case studies from Operation Mindbridge, practiced crisis negotiation techniques using psychological profiling methods, and learned to gather human intelligence through emotional analysis rather than traditional interrogation. Approaches. Captain Lisa Rodriguez, one of Sofia's advanced students, had been selected for the program after demonstrating exceptional intuitive understanding of cultural dynamics during peacekeeping operations in Africa. Before Sofia's training methods became available, Captain Rodriguez's emotional perceptiveness had been considered a minor asset at best, but now it was being developed into specialized capabilities for cultural intelligence and diplomatic liaison work. Technical Sergeant Reyes, Captain Rodriguez said during a practical exercise session, "Your methods have completely changed how I understand my own psychological capabilities. I always knew I could read people effectively, but I never realized that ability could be systematized and applied as a military skill." Sofia smiled with the satisfaction of someone who was seeing her vision for psychological intelligence becoming institutional reality. The military had not only accepted her approach, they had embraced it so completely that emotional intelligence was now considered essential training for personnel assigned to complex cultural environments, diplomatic missions, and crisis resolution operations. The transformation extended far beyond individual training programs. The Department of Defense had established the Human Terrain Analysis Division, a new intelligence specialty dedicated to applying psychological analysis to operational planning. Sofia served as the division's technical advisor, helping to develop protocols that integrated emotional intelligence into strategic decision-making at the highest levels of military command. General Patricia Reynolds, who had initially been skeptical of Sofia's unconventional approach, now championed psychological intelligence as one of the military's most valuable innovations. During a Joint Chiefs briefing that Sofia attended as a technical consultant, General Reynolds presented data showing that operations incorporating psychological intelligence had success rates significantly higher than comparable missions using only conventional approaches. The integration of psychological intelligence into military operations has proven more valuable than any technological advancement we've implemented in the past decade, General Reynolds reported. Personnel trained in emotional intelligence techniques are identifying and resolving problems that conventional intelligence never detected, preventing conflicts before they escalate to violence, and achieving mission objectives through understanding rather than force. Sofia's influence reached beyond American military operations. NATO allies had requested training in psychological intelligence methods, and several foreign military services were implementing similar programs based on Sofia's techniques. The approach that had been considered too unconventional for American service was now being adopted by military organizations worldwide. But the most significant transformation was occurring in military recruitment and evaluation procedures. The psychological assessment protocols that had classified Sofia as too emotional had been completely revised to identify and develop emotional intelligence rather than screening it out. Dr. Richard Stone, who had originally rejected Sofia's application, now led the team responsible for identifying candidates whose psychological sensitivity made them suitable for advanced psychological operations training. We were eliminating exactly the personnel we most needed, Dr. Stone admitted during a conference on military psychology that Sofia attended as a keynote speaker. Staff Sergeant Reyes proved that what we classified as psychological liabilities were actually strategic capabilities that we were systematically removing from our force structure. The new evaluation procedures had identified hundreds of military personnel whose emotional intelligence had been overlooked or suppressed under previous assessment methods. These soldiers were being retrained and reassigned to positions where their psychological capabilities could contribute to mission success rather than being hidden or ignored. Sofia's former colleagues from her communications specialist days at Fort Sterling had followed her transformation with amazement and pride. Sergeant Rivers, who had supervised Sofia's routine radio monitoring duties, now served as an instructor in the psychological intelligence program, teaching students to recognize the kind of patterns that Sofia had identified in routine military communications years earlier. I watched Sofia analyze radio transmissions for months, never understanding that she was developing intelligence insights that our conventional methods couldn't detect, Sergeant Rivers explained to her students. She was identifying psychological patterns in military personnel that predicted operational problems weeks before they became obvious to command structures. The success of psychological intelligence operations had attracted attention from civilian intelligence agencies as well. The CIA and FBI had requested cross-training opportunities, recognizing that Sofia's methods for understanding and influencing human behavior had applications beyond military contexts. Her techniques were being adapted for counter-terrorism operations, diplomatic negotiations, and law enforcement situations where psychological insight could prevent violence or resolve crises. Sofia's personal recognition had evolved from military awards to academic acknowledgement. Universities were offering her positions as a professor of military psychology, and she had been invited to present her research at international conferences on behavioral analysis and crisis resolution. Publishers were requesting books about her methods, and documentary filmmakers wanted to tell the story of how emotional intelligence had become a military weapon. But Sofia remained focused on the practical applications of psychological intelligence rather than personal recognition. She continued developing new training methods, analyzing operational results to refine her techniques, and mentoring personnel who were learning to apply emotional intelligence in increasingly sophisticated ways. The most meaningful recognition came from the soldiers whose lives had been affected by psychological intelligence operations. Sofia regularly received messages from military personnel who had been helped by psychological intervention, from hostages who had been rescued through negotiation rather than force, and from communities where psychological intelligence had prevented conflicts that could have resulted in civilian casualties. Master Sergeant Thompson, who had been Sofia's first mentor in applying psychological intelligence to military operations, now served as her deputy in the Human Terrain Analysis Division. During one of their planning sessions for expanding psychological intelligence training, Thompson reflected on how completely the military's understanding of emotional capabilities had been transformed. "When you first showed me your communications analysis, I knew you had exceptional capabilities," Thompson said. "But I never imagined that your approach would fundamentally change how the military thinks about human intelligence and psychological operations." Sofia appreciated Thompson's recognition, but she was more interested in ensuring that the transformation was permanent and comprehensive. She was working to embed psychological intelligence so deeply into military training and operations that future personnel would never face the barriers she had encountered. "Linda, the most important thing is that soldiers like me will never again be told they're too emotional for military service," Sofia replied. "We've proven that understanding emotions is one of the most powerful capabilities the military can develop." The psychological intelligence revolution that Sofia had initiated was becoming self-sustaining, with new generations of military personnel being trained to apply emotional understanding as naturally as they used conventional weapons or tactical equipment. The military had learned that the soldier who could read hearts and minds was often more valuable than the soldier who could only read maps and follow orders. 5 years after Operation Mindbridge, Master Sergeant Sofia Reyes stood in the same Pentagon briefing room where she had once received recognition for completing the military's hardest mission. This time, she was presenting the annual report on psychological intelligence operations to the Secretary of Defense and the Joint Chiefs of Staff, documenting how emotional intelligence had become one of the military's most valuable strategic capabilities. The conference table was surrounded by the highest-ranking military officials in the United States, but Sofia felt completely comfortable addressing them. Her transformation from a rejected communications specialist to the military's leading expert on psychological intelligence had given her the confidence that came from proving herself under the most demanding circumstances imaginable. "Madam Secretary, distinguished members of the Joint Chiefs," Sofia began, "psychological intelligence operations have achieved a 94% success rate in crisis resolution over the past 5 years, with applications ranging from hostage negotiations to diplomatic interventions to counter-terrorism operations. What began as an experimental approach has become an essential capability that has saved hundreds of lives and prevented dozens of conflicts from escalating to violence." Secretary Williams reviewed the comprehensive statistics that documented the success of psychological intelligence across multiple theaters of operation. The numbers were impressive, but more important was the fundamental shift in how the military approached human-centered challenges. "Master Sergeant Reyes," Secretary Williams said, "your development of psychological intelligence as a military capability has proven more strategically valuable than most technological innovations we've implemented in recent decades. Your methods are now being used by every branch of service and have been adopted by allied military organizations worldwide." Sofia appreciated the recognition, but she was more focused on the long-term implications of the transformation she had helped initiate. The military now recruited, trained, and deployed personnel with emotional intelligence as systematically as it developed any other specialized capability, and the results had exceeded even her most optimistic predictions. The briefing included success stories from around the world where psychological intelligence had achieved results that conventional military approaches couldn't match. In Syria, a psychological operations specialist trained in Sofia's methods had negotiated the release of 43 civilian hostages by understanding and addressing the cultural and personal motivations of their captors. In Somalia, emotional intelligence techniques had prevented a tribal conflict that could have resulted in thousands of casualties. In Korea, psychological analysis had identified and resolved communication problems between allied forces that were threatening joint operational effectiveness. But the most significant impact was on military personnel themselves. The integration of psychological intelligence training had reduced combat stress casualties, improved unit cohesion, and enhanced leadership effectiveness across all levels of military service. Soldiers who understood human psychology were better equipped to handle the emotional demands of military service while maintaining operational effectiveness. After the briefing concluded, Sofia walked through the Pentagon corridors toward her office in the newly established Center for Human Terrain Analysis. The center occupied an entire floor of the Pentagon, and employed more than 200 personnel who applied psychological intelligence to military operations worldwide. Sofia's office overlooked the Potomac River, with walls covered by maps, psychological assessment charts, and photographs from successful operations where emotional intelligence had made the crucial difference. But the most meaningful item on her desk was a framed letter from Captain Derek Morrison, the peacekeeping commander whose psychological distress she had first identified through communications analysis years earlier. "Dear Master Sergeant Reyes," Morrison had written, "I wanted you to know that the psychological intervention you recommended likely saved my life and the lives of my soldiers. Your early identification of our unit's stress problems allowed us to get help before we reached a breaking point. You saw what we couldn't see in ourselves, and you used that insight to protect us. Thank you for proving that caring about people is one of the most powerful capabilities a soldier can have." Sofia kept Morrison's letter as a reminder that psychological intelligence wasn't just about completing dramatic missions. It was about understanding and protecting the human beings who served in military operations around the world. A knock on her office door interrupted her reflection. Lieutenant Colonel Maria Santos entered, carrying files that contained applications from potential candidates for the Advanced Psychological Intelligence Training Program. Santos had been one of Sofia's first students and now served as her deputy director for training and development. "Master Sergeant," Santos said, "we have applications from 127 candidates for next month's advanced training class. These are all personnel who have been identified through our new evaluation procedures as having exceptional emotional intelligence capabilities." Sofia reviewed the applications with the satisfaction of someone whose vision was becoming institutional reality. Among the candidates were soldiers whose psychological sensitivity had previously been overlooked, officers whose emotional intelligence had been discouraged by conventional military culture, and specialists whose understanding of human behavior had been considered irrelevant to their military roles. "Maria, these candidates represent exactly what we were hoping to achieve," Sofia said, noting the diversity of backgrounds and specialties represented in the applications. 5 years ago, most of these soldiers would have been told their emotional intelligence made them unsuitable for military service. Now they're being recruited specifically because of those capabilities. Santos nodded in agreement. She had experienced the transformation personally, having been discouraged from pursuing leadership positions because her empathetic management style was considered too soft for military command. Now she was responsible for training the next generation of psychological intelligence specialists and had been promoted ahead of peers who had once criticized her emotional approach to leadership. The training program had evolved far beyond Sofia's original methods to become a comprehensive system for developing emotional intelligence as a military specialty. Students learned not just psychological analysis techniques, but also cultural intelligence, crisis negotiation, behavioral prediction, and psychological influence methods that could be applied across the full spectrum of military operations. "We're also receiving requests from civilian agencies who want psychological intelligence training," Santos continued. "The FBI wants to send agents for hostage negotiation training. The State Department is requesting diplomatic personnel be trained in cultural psychology, and several police departments want crisis resolution methods." Sofia had anticipated this expansion of psychological intelligence beyond military applications. The techniques that had proven valuable for military operations were equally relevant for law enforcement, diplomatic negotiations, emergency response, and any situation where understanding human behavior could prevent violence or resolve conflicts. Later that afternoon, Sofia visited the Walter Reed National Military Medical Center, where she maintained a regular schedule of sessions with military personnel who were dealing with combat stress, adjustment difficulties, or psychological injuries from their service. This work wasn't officially part of her duties, but Sofia considered it essential to her understanding of how psychological intelligence could support military personnel throughout their careers. Sergeant First Class Michael Torres, a combat veteran who had been struggling with PTSD from multiple deployments, was one of her regular counseling participants. Torres had initially been skeptical of psychological intervention, viewing it as incompatible with military toughness, but Sofia's approach had helped him understand that psychological strength was as important as physical strength in military service. Master Sergeant Reyes, Torres said during their session, "When I first came here, I thought dealing with emotions was a sign of weakness. You helped me understand that understanding my emotions was actually what made me a better soldier and a better person." Sofia appreciated Torres's progress, but she was more interested in ensuring that future soldiers wouldn't face the same stigma around psychological support that had made his recovery more difficult than necessary. As evening approached, Sofia drove to Arlington National Cemetery, where she maintained a tradition of visiting on the anniversary of Operation Mindbridge. She walked among the rows of white headstones, reflecting on the military personnel who had given their lives in service to their country, and thinking about how psychological intelligence might have prevented some of those losses if it had been available earlier. Standing in the quiet cemetery, Sofia thought about the 7-year-old girl who had dreamed of using her gift to protect people, and the young woman who had been told her emotional intelligence made her unsuitable for military service. She had proven that understanding people wasn't a weakness, it was one of the most powerful capabilities available when human psychology became the battlefield. The military had learned that soldiers who were called too emotional might actually be exactly what modern operations required. And Sofia had ensured that future generations of military personnel would never face the barriers that had once seemed insurmountable. That she had accomplished something more significant than completing the military's hardest mission. She had changed how the military understood the relationship between emotions and strength, proving that caring about people was not a limitation, but a weapon that could save lives and achieve objectives that conventional approaches could never match. The soldier they had called too emotional had become the architect of a revolution in military psychology, and her legacy would protect and empower generations of military personnel whose greatest strength was their ability to understand the human heart. Up next, you've got 2 more standout stories right on your screen. If this one hit the mark, you won't want to pass these up. Just click and check them out. And don't forget to subscribe and turn on the notification bell so you don't miss any upload from us.